Good morning and welcome to the PEI Open House series focused on economic inclusion in an aging world, opportunities and challenges. I'm going to give the floor a few minutes for various people to come in and to come out and to log on correctly. We are apologizing for our slight delay to start off. We had some of our own technical challenges. My name is Colin Andrews. I'm the program manager for the Partnership for Economic Inclusion. We are delighted to welcome a very stellar panel here today for this open house, and I'll introduce them shortly. But before we begin, let's start with some housekeeping rules. We are encouraging you all to use the chat box throughout this discussion. So please feel free to introduce yourselves to let everybody know where you are from. And as we go through the discussion, certainly feel very encouraged to ask questions. This is a simultaneously interpreted event, so we do have simultaneous translation in Arabic, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. So please click on the global icon on the Zoom platform and select your language of choice, however you prefer to hear the presentations. At this stage, I would like to welcome our presenters. We have a really exciting and quite a diverse panel here for you today. I'd like to announce Cuyen Tran, representing Help Age. We have Julio Mendigure Fernandez from the government of Peru. And we have also Jasmine Raj Bandari representing the World Bank. So we'll hear from these different perspectives. As your moderator for today, just to be quite candid to say that certainly as we think about economic inclusion within our work, we're often very much focused on the younger age cohorts. Of course, the other end of that dynamic is the question of aging. This is a new topic for us really to handle, and we see this session very much as an exploratory, nascent topic. So we would encourage you to come with questions and experiences and to share those questions and experiences with us. And we're looking at the question of age, both from the perspective of how we might tailor programs for these population groups, but how we may also tailor services for these population groups within existing programs at the same time. With that said, we do have a few short slides for framing, so I would like to introduce my colleague Himanshi Jain, who will provide these framing slides just to help us understand this topic a little bit. But Himanshi, if I am correct, I understand you'll be starting with quite an interesting video for us to see. Over to you.
Thanks, Colin. The video should play in just a second.
Uncertainty.
Invisible.
Miedo.
Discarded.
Chao, chao.
Nadie te va a cuidar.
Ya no puedo hacer nada.
Calma.
Meli.
Experiência.
มีความสุข
Tenderness.
Juventud.
Wrinkles.
从容淡定
Lecciones aprendidas.
Gratitude. El amor.
experience
Hermoso.
wisdom
Tranquilidad.
சுதந்திரமாக இருக்கிறது.
I'll be happy.
Thanks, everyone. And now I'll share my screen to give a very brief presentation to just sort of frame this discussion. I hope you can see my screen and hear me okay. So welcome, everyone. The beautiful video we just saw reminded us why we need to work on this agenda urgently. But let's also start by reviewing some facts on why this is an extremely relevant agenda for developing countries as well. Now, there is already a large share of older adults. There's actually more 65 plus globally as we speak than those under 5. And the downward fertility rate trends and the rising life expectancy across regions point to a growing share of older adults. An interesting fact that I came across was that, in fact, globally, we are expected to approach replacement fertility rates of 2.1 children per woman in this decade. And what that means is that at a global level, new births will not be enough to replace new deaths. So, population in one generation is not going to replace the next. Now, the second point is that many of these older adults, and 66% to be exact, actually are currently living in less developed regions. These countries typically have low social insurance coverage, health coverage, pension coverage, and so on. And they're already witnessing changes in societal dynamics, new rural to urban migration. So as these countries, as the population in these countries age, they are at a heightened risk of poverty and inequality relative to, say, OECD countries, which actually came in with a sort of much broader coverage of social security. Now, the graph that you see on your right is a plot of labor force participation rates by age. As you can see, across income types, the labor force participation rates drop after age 50. But for low-income countries, which is that red line that you see, the reality is that many older workers actually keep working into their old age. And we know that, for many of them, it is really a necessity, but for some, it could also be a choice. Lastly, what we see is that the economic and social contributions of older adult workers are significant, but they're not explicitly captured and quite frankly often ignored. Estimates suggest that in US and EU, their contributions can add up to as much as 7.3% of GDP. So here's the question in front of us. How can we think of policies that support both healthy and productive longevity? And how can these policies, and even we in our conversations, be more inclusive by bringing in all age groups into this discussion on aging and longevity? So as you would have guessed, like with most things in policy, the answer does depend a lot on the country context and, which stage in the demographic transition the country finds itself in. But what is probably important is that as policymakers and practitioners think about policies, they adopt a life cycle approach that is focused on human capital accumulation across the different stages of life. And there are 4 principles, which we like to call the CDEF principles, that we would like to suggest as guiding principles to think about in the context of aging. And these are the principles of choice, default, empathy, and flexibility, hence the CDEF nomenclature. Now, by choice, we mean offering choice through policies and practices that will maximize individual agency. Defaults refer to things like, opt-ins into programs, mandatory contributions required, etc. And these should be designed to protect those who fail to either exercise choice and to encourage sort of socially desirable outcomes. Empathy is aimed at promoting autonomy, dignity, and equal access for older people. And flexibility will allow our policies and programs to adapt over time and accommodate the diversity that we see among older people and across the life course. So next I have for you some questions to consider as we listen to our speakers and we collectively discuss how to move the needle on this agenda. The first thing that comes to mind is on program design itself. So, what are some cash plus interventions to think of? The OPA model, which our next speaker, Quen, is going to talk about, it has about 10 to 12 interventions ranging from, say, livelihood support, socio-emotional support, preventative health checkups for older adults, and many more. So what is the package of interventions that makes sense in a particular country context? Beyond picking a package of interventions, the design modalities are also something that we need to consider. How to scale these programs, how to be inclusive across multiple dimensions, so age, gender, location, so on, and how to make these programs sustainable by bringing in government, so civil society, community-led efforts, and private sector. An important question to grapple with is also what should be the targeting for these programs? A question that we often discuss in our teams is who is the old in the context of these programs? And we can all sort of reflect on our own personal experiences and see that not all 60-year-olds or 65-year-olds we know have the same needs. So thinking about targeting becomes important. And while doing so, it's also important to maybe think about whether these programs that we're talking about need to target older adults as beneficiaries, or if we can also expand our thinking and think about services for older people. And I'll give you some examples in my next slide. Colin mentioned this, are there some low-hanging fruits? Are we doing, can we sort of rethink our existing programs and delivery systems to just better include and accommodate the needs of older adults? And finally, and maybe also more importantly, how can we contribute to research to strengthen the economic and social arguments behind these approaches? To close the framing session, I would like to provoke your thinking on how we might unlock new opportunities through economic inclusion in a world that we know is aging and in a world where aging is likely to stay given the trends that we see. So I'd like to group my thoughts into two buckets. First are areas where we target older people as beneficiaries. So for example, social pension programs, they are starting to see a rapid growth in coverage across many developing countries itself. Can we consider cash plus interventions as part of these programs? To take the example of digital and financial inclusion programs, can we start looking at the needs of older adults and pilot approaches to help them benefit from these inclusion efforts? There is a lot of rich evidence on community-based approaches, say in savings, etc. Are there lessons to be learned from these approaches which target specific groups like youth or women, and sort of extend that to older cohorts as well? We can probably also look at our delivery systems from the perspective of older adults and make changes on those fronts. Now, what I do want to emphasize is that while I am talking about the benefits of these and putting you in the frame of, okay, these are aimed at improving the lives of older adults, any of these changes, in fact, will actually improve the lives of the most marginalized, whom we are already aiming to serve. So what is good for older adults is actually good for the rest of the population as well. And it's something we need to also keep in mind as we advance this dialogue. The second bucket to think about is services for older people. And if you recall the numbers I shared earlier, the demand for these services is probably only expected to grow as we are going to see more and more shares of older adults in the global population. So can our public work programs sort of include training and provide aged home care services, for example? Are there intergenerational linkages we can create through our programs? For example, in East Asian economies, we do see this concept of the young old caring for the old, and even the young old caring, helping with childcare responsibilities. Probably, and one thing to keep in mind is in a world where aging is happening rapidly and there is a shrinking labor force, these kinds of intergenerational linkages can also help countries sustain growth and support women to enter in their labor forces. So I'd like to just leave you with these thoughts and pass the virtual floor back to Colin to introduce our speakers, and would just like to reiterate that please use the chat function and the question answers to share your thoughts on this. And let's think more about economic inclusion in a world where we are living longer. Over to you, Colin.
Thanks so much, Himanshi, and thank you, colleagues. I think that was a great start to provide some framing, and I'm going to move very nimbly to our speakers that we've just introduced. And really the idea of this is to share some very diverse experience and some very diverse perspectives. In this context, I'm really glad and thankful to introduce Nguyen Tran from HelpAge. HelpAge have been a front runner on these programs, and I know you were just talking before this call, Nguyen, on a lot of training that you'll be delivering, I think, for up to 10 different countries. So we will pass the presentation. You are here for the live questions and answers, but I understand we've just pre-recorded your slots to make sure that everything fits and hangs together, but delighted to have you here both live and in a recorded fashion at the same time. So we'll pass over to your intervention. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Quinn from HealthAge International. Welcome to my presentation on social and economic inclusion of older people through the Older People's Associations, or OPA. In the First World Assembly on Aging in 1982, the Assembly resolution recommended countries to establish Older People's Associations to promote older people active participation in societies and development. Therefore, for over the past 35 years, HealthAge, network member, UN agencies, and local and national government have joined hands to develop and promote OPAs in large number of countries throughout the world. There are now more than 1 million OPA with hundreds of millions of members, especially in low and low-middle income countries. This is a typical OPA organization structure which has been designed to promote full local participation and ownership of the OPAs. A typical OPA has around 50 to 70 members and is based at village or community level. The OPA has three 70% plus or minus requirements. One, 70% are older people. Second, 70% are women. Third, 70% are socially and or economically poor. The OPA is managed by an OPA management board, which is elected every 2 years by its member, and at least 50% of the board members are women. The members are divided into neighborhood groups. Each group has their own group leaders. The members are encouraged to form and participate in various groups that are under the club, such as social and cultural groups, hobby groups, physical exercise and sport group, home care group, livelihood groups, and others. The OPA model is designed to be attractive to young and old, men and women, poor and non-poor. Normally, the OPA has at least 8 core components, which is based on the top needs of its members and community, which are 1. Social and cultural. 2. Food and income security. 3. Healthy and active aging. 4. Community-based care. 5. Community-led development. 6. Lifelong learning. 7. Rights and entitlement. And 8. Resource mobilization. Depending on other needs, the community can add more components such as disaster risk reduction and climate change. However, today I will focus in more detail component 2, the food and income security component. The food and income security component is made up of 5 subcomponents, which are 1. Pro-poor and age-friendly livelihood awareness. The OPA has more than 400 pro-poor and age and environmentally friendly livelihood topics for members to select from. Each member can select what is most appropriate for them and their family. Second, The OPA has their own revolving fund scheme, which enable its members to have easy access to revolving fund loans that brings income opportunity to both the members and the OPAs. 100% of the revolving fund interest and principal stays with the OPA, which is used to support local community development initiatives and cover the running costs of the OPAs. Third is technical support to ensure members has a technical support that they need. The OPA has livelihood support groups and livelihood volunteers. Fourth is work. The OPA also help members to find employment and or work for people that are in need of work within their communities and in local areas. Fifth and last is the access to government social allowance, which consists of providing awareness on social allowance, monitor the access, and provide legal service as needed. Using national and project data, we can calculate the national income of older people by source. First, the total income from OH allowance is 0.25 billion per year. Second, total income from contributory pension is 6.5 billion US dollar per year. Third, income from work and other is more than 12 billion US dollar per year. Just to note, 1 year working in OH is equal to 12 years of social pension. This clearly highlights the importance of work in OH. Work or being active brings many benefits. First, the most obvious benefit of work in OH is financial, especially when retirement savings are meager and Social Security is insufficient or modest. Second, for many, working offers a sense of independence. It means that they are no longer relying on others and are still able to contribute to their families and society. Working is an important form of social connection. As a result, it can significantly reduce isolation, and in doing so, many also help promote active and positive aging. Fourth, it can often make people feel productive and more optimistic about life. Fifth, working in OA can help older people to keep mentally and physically active. Sixth, many older people consider work as enjoyment. Many older people enjoy going to work, particularly because of the challenge that it brings. For that matter, some people end up retiring and then going back to work simply because they cannot stand the lifestyle change come with retirement. The OPAs also bring many other benefits. For example, these are results of 3 recent OPA projects implemented in 10 provinces in Vietnam. The total funding amount were 3.2 million US dollar, which enabled the project to establish 567 OPAs, or at a cost of less than 5,800 US dollar per OPA. The OPA had a total of more than 30,000 members, with close to 75% of the members and 60% of the management board were women. The project directly benefited more than 670,000 people. After 2 years, the average increase in member annual income were close to 60%. More than 750 social and cultural groups were formed, and more than 1,000 sport and exercise groups were formed. More than 97% of the members reported practicing regular exercise at least 3 times per week. The OPA have conducted more than 90,000 health checkups in the past 12 months. On average, each member received 3 health checkups per year, and the health insurance coverage rate were close to 98%. The OPA had more than 5,000 care volunteers providing regular care service to more than 3,000 clients. More than 5,600 self-help and community development activities were conducted, and more than 22,000 people have received access to legal support service, and the OPA have managed to fundraise more than $1 million US. Now, looking at the impact level, close to 99% of the members reported feeling happier since joining the OPA. Close to 96% reported improved solidarity within their families and communities. 93% reported having increased self-confidence. 91% reported increased empowerment. More than 90% reported being healthier. And close to 90% reported being wealthier. The OPA model has also won many awards and recognitions, such as the Grand Prize winner for the Healthy Aging Prize for Asian Innovation in the WHO Healthy Aging 50, HealthAge was recognized for our OPA work, which contributed to transforming the world to be a better place to grow old. Was selected as best practice in promoting healthy and active aging in 6 WHO publications. Was best practice in achieving SDG in UNDESA publication. Was best practice in the World Bank and JICA publication, and in many other publications. The unique characteristics of the advanced OPA model are: 1. It is cost-effective and affordable for low and low-middle income countries. Second, it is attractive to young and old, men and women, poor and non-poor. Third, it is dynamic, able to be replicated in rural, urban, coastal, and mountainous areas. Fourth, it is sustainable, able to continue to operate and grow even after the funding ends. Fifth, it is replicable, as evidenced by its rapid growth in many countries in Asia. In conclusion, investing in OPA can greatly improve the social and economic status of millions of current and future old, especially for low and middle income countries. In particularly, work provided through the OPAs can serve to keep older people active both physically and mentally. Working in old age can offer many short-term and long-term benefits. At the same time, many older people enjoy working, finding it emotionally and financially rewarding. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your presentation. Just to note that there are many questions coming in on the chat box, questions around the operational aspects of managing these programs, and questions in particular about the target group and perhaps how this target group might be connected across the age continuum. So as we think about youth, how do we protect youth in the future to make sure that their programs are that the operations are going to help them into an aging process. We'll come back to some of these questions in the Q&A session to follow. But Kien, one question that we had for you was, what are the plans to share and expand the advanced OPA model beyond Vietnam? So where are you in that process, or to what degree can this work be customized in different contexts? And you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Okay,
perfect. Very good. So first of all, thank you very much, Colin. And I'm very honored to be invited as one of the guest speakers here. By the end of 2022, more than 5,400 advanced OPAs have been established in all 63 provinces and cities in the countries in Vietnam. And the government plans to increase it to 10,000 by 2030. As for global sharing and learning, we have conducted hundreds of training for a very large number of development practitioners and government officials, mostly in Asia. And we plan to share this more widely globally. In the first 3 months of this year, we have already conducted OPA training for network members and country office in Jordan, Lebanon, Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia. And for the remaining year, we are planning to conduct more OPA training for countries in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and also the Americas as well. We have also already helped support a country to pilot this model, pilot and localize this model in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Thailand. And we hope to expand this model in more and more countries in the near futures.
Thanks. There's a question, Kuyen, in the chat box from James Devashashayam. And he asks, what are some of the challenges in managing the enterprises in case of older persons? So what are, if you can just reflect maybe on one or two of the big operational challenges when you get these enterprises and these groups together. If you could think of maybe just one or two of the top issues that you are struggling to address.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very good question. Normally, when we do the training for them, we would let them know that the development cycle stage of the OPA would take 2-year period. And normally after the first training, a lot of people are not very confident because it's very, very complex and very, very holistic type of model. And so we would tell them that there are stages. The first 3-6 months, you might feel less confident. People might go in and out, but don't worry, that's very normal. And as the training, we progress with the training and also with the practice and the learning, that you will get more confident and you would be able to get the skills to manage and also to like that. And so normally it's very difficult for people to understand that it takes a 2-year period of time. And in the first period might have many difficulties, but that's very normal. And you need to be patient and also to persevere, because after 1 year, you'll be more confident and see the growth after 1 year. And after 2 years, normally you see the expansion. And normally the OPA will graduate only after 2 years of technical support, and they'll become financially sustainable as well as technically sustainable.
Thanks so much. Well, look, let's press on and we'll come back to you in the questions and answers. I will introduce our next speaker from the government of Peru, Mr. Julio Mendigure Fernandez, and on some innovative work taking place in Peru. Julio, I think you will present in Spanish, is that correct?
Sí, muy buenos días, Colin. Muy buenos días a todos los participantes de este importante panel. Yo quisiera expresar en nombre del Gobierno del Perú, en nombre del Ministerio de Desarrollo e Inclusión Social y en nombre de todos los adultos mayores que forman parte de este maravilloso programa Pensión 65, nuestra gratitud por haber sido invitados para este encuentro de reflexión, de análisis y de comparación de experiencias en el mundo para promover la inclusión económica de los adultos mayores. Si me permiten, yo agradecería a los colegas de soporte que pudieran introducir o presentar el video que nosotros habíamos preparado, un video muy corto para comenzar esta presentación. Adelante, por favor, con el video.
Saberes productivos. Mientras sus costumbres sigan vivas, su voz también lo estará.
Pensión 65 no solo entrega una subvención económica a 627.924 personas adultas mayores en situación de vulnerabilidad. Este programa social va más allá y facilita el acceso de servicios a sus usuarias y usuarios en todo el país. Saberes Productivos es una muestra de este compromiso. Mediante la asistencia técnica a los gobiernos locales, esta intervención genera espacios para revalorar a las personas mayores a partir de los conocimientos que portan y que pueden transmitir a las nuevas generaciones. Pasaron 10 años desde que se inició en los distritos de Sarwa y los Morochucos en Ayacucho, y hoy 850 gobiernos locales han hecho suya esta iniciativa. La pandemia detuvo algunas actividades, pero hoy se reactivaron y junto a las municipalidades se organizaron tiendas virtuales, encuentros de saberes y ferias locales. De esta manera, Pensión 65 trabaja por el bienestar de la población más vulnerable del país.
Los chiquitos también tienen que aprender, papá. Entonces, si no aprenderemos, no hay música también. Claro, cuando yo muero, ¿quién va a enseñar?
Ministerio de Desarrollo e Inclusión Social.
Bicentenario del Perú, 2024.
Gobierno del Perú.
Muchísimas gracias. Este video es una síntesis sobre esta maravillosa intervención que ha implementado el Programa Nacional de Asistencia Solidaria, más conocido como Pensión 65, en todo el territorio nacional. Yo quisiera señalar que Pensión 65 es un programa que ha sido creado principalmente para mitigar los efectos de la pobreza extrema en el Perú como parte de una política social del Estado en el año 2011. Principalmente a través de una subvención económica. Pero adicionalmente al mirar al ser humano, a ese adulto mayor que vive una situación de vulnerabilidad, encontramos una oportunidad para atender otras necesidades del ser humano, que va precisamente en el campo de la salud mental, en la necesidad de su participación y de su inclusión como parte de la comunidad, como un activo de su propio distrito. Es en ese sentido, tal como se señaló en el video, en el año 2013, se inicia esta intervención en 2 emblemáticos distritos golpeados por el terrorismo en el Perú, que es precisamente en Morochucos y en Sarwa. Empieza el programa, esta intervención con apenas 13 distritos en ese primer año y alrededor de unos 800 usuarios. 10 años después, tal como se ha señalado, tenemos más de 800 municipalidades o gobiernos locales y más de 50,000 adultos mayores que son reconocidos, revalorados a partir de sus conocimientos, de las prácticas ancestrales que ellos los conocen y los difunden precisamente de generación en generación. Esta intervención fue institucionalizada mediante una resolución directoral precisamente el 6 de junio del año 2014. En una lámina de línea de tiempo, esta intervención ha experimentado varias etapas. Desde su inicio hasta, digamos, su expansión y su sostenibilidad, han pasado algunos años, alrededor de 5 años, para consolidar la estrategia, incorporar a los gobiernos locales, persuadirlos, formar un equipo técnico, generar documentos normativos que orienten la asistencia técnica a los gobiernos locales, hasta su consolidación en el año 2019. Y finalmente, aunque vino la pandemia, afectó sin duda algunas actividades de carácter presencial, pero no afectó el espíritu, tampoco el compromiso de los gobiernos locales y de todo el equipo del programa Pensión 65. Porque si bien las actividades presenciales fueron reducidas, el programa tuvo capacidad creativa para mantener algunas de ellas a través de las plataformas virtuales, como más adelante entraremos en algún detalle. Más o menos ya superando, aunque todavía estamos en emergencia sanitaria, pero después de haber logrado altos porcentajes de cobertura de vacunación en nuestros usuarios, se han reactivado desde el año pasado y en este momento, tal como informamos, tenemos 850 municipalidades que han reactivado esta intervención y más de 51,000 usuarios se encuentran participando. Es muy importante señalar el procedimiento de esta intervención, que tiene 4 etapas. La primera comienza con institucionalizar, es decir, es una decisión política del gobierno local que se manifiesta a través de un acuerdo de todo el directorio del Consejo Municipal, que luego se expresa en una resolución, en un documento normativo o una ordenanza del gobierno local, y la asignación de un presupuesto. Este presupuesto sirve generalmente para la contratación de algún guía, de algún profesor, también para la compra de algunos insumos o materiales que pueden requerir los adultos mayores. Luego, la siguiente etapa es la identificación, la recuperación, el registro de la diversidad de prácticas y conocimientos tradicionales que tienen nuestros adultos mayores. Y hemos visto una diversidad muy amplia que con el tiempo lo hemos ido clasificando y tenemos un catálogo de estos saberes. La tercera etapa consiste en que la propia comunidad se apropia de estos saberes, y hemos visto en muchos lugares, por ejemplo, con la confección de instrumentos musicales, la revitalización, por ejemplo, de las lenguas originarias, precisamente por aquí cerca de Lima, por ejemplo, la revitalización del jacaru, que es un dialecto, una lengua que está ya, digamos, en riesgo de su extinción, pero gracias a nuestros usuarios, las calles tienen las señaléticas, los nombres en jácaro, y nuestros adultos mayores van a las escuelas a enseñar y a transmitir en lengua jácaro, digamos, todo lo que son los aprendizajes cotidianos. Lo mismo fue en la Amazonía, por ejemplo, al revitalizar otra lengua o dialecto amazónica, como es el Cucama Cucamiria. Entonces, de esta forma, los adultos mayores transmiten a la población, a los jóvenes, para que estos conocimientos que lo adquirieron a través de la escuela de la vida no se pierda, sino se mantenga como permanente y como parte de nuestra identidad cultural. Y finalmente, la cuarta etapa consiste en la promoción, en la implementación de estos emprendimientos que se van generando a través de las transmisiones, pero a través de la articulación entre el gobierno local y otros aliados. En adelante comentaré, por ejemplo, de qué manera y qué emprendimientos han sido emblemáticos y los mecanismos mediante los cuales se promueve su impulso, su comercialización y naturalmente la mejora de la calidad de vida de los adultos mayores. Como bien sabemos, el mundo entero experimenta un proceso de envejecimiento acelerado. El Perú no es la excepción, pero en el programa Pensión 65 miramos al ser humano en todas sus dimensiones. Es en ese sentido que vimos la necesidad de cubrir con algunas soluciones e intervenciones en el campo de la salud, pero en el campo de su participación y particularmente en su capacidad productiva, logramos identificar que había enorme potencial en los adultos mayores para seguir desarrollando actividades productivas que mejoren sus ingresos a través de la producción, la mejora de sus productos, la comercialización, y esto podría ayudarlos naturalmente en su autonomía social y económica. Y es en ese sentido que estas imágenes revelan el esfuerzo que hace el programa a través de su personal, de sus técnicos, de sus promotores y también de los aliados para capacitarlos, por ejemplo, en aspectos de manejo de sus cuentas bancarias, el uso de las tarjetas que se les ha entregado para que ellos puedan cobrar la subvención económica, pero también hacer y recordar operaciones matemáticas o comprensión lectora que en suma contribuye a que las personas adultas mayores puedan potenciar estas capacidades que los tienen intactos, pero que necesitan sin duda un acompañamiento y una asistencia técnica por parte del equipo de Pensión 65 o de las municipalidades. Esta articulación que vengo señalando se expresa pues en algunas prestaciones que son tangibles, como por ejemplo en este momento tenemos 13.351 adultos mayores que son parte del programa, que han implementado alrededor de 14.000 emprendimientos productivos, principalmente en la mejora de los cultivos, en manufacturas, la elaboración de los productos de consumo individual y de subsistencia, algunos de ellos, pero también la crianza de animales y artesanías. Se han generado, gracias a esta articulación con los gobiernos locales, con otras instituciones del sector público y también privados, más de 500 opciones de comercialización para que los adultos mayores puedan expender, puedan vender sus productos elaborados a partir de estos espacios de aprendizaje y de recuerdo de muchas actividades que ellos van desarrollando. Tenemos más de 1.300 usuarios que están en el Registro Nacional del Artesano del Ministerio de Comercio Exterior y Turismo, lo que les permite digamos, contribuir y potenciar la promoción de sus productos de artesanía y el reconocimiento a los artesanos mayores de 65 años por su trayectoria, por su aporte a nuestra identidad cultural. Más de 730 usuarios que participan en otra intervención de otro programa social denominado el Haku Wiñay, que gracias a ellos tenemos alrededor de 1.700 usuarios implementando emprendimientos. Y podemos señalar también que hay 304.000 usuarios que reciben educación financiera, por ejemplo, con la tenencia de una cuenta de ahorro, la priorización de sus gastos, y esto es complementado con visitas domiciliares que hace nuestro personal a nuestros usuarios. Y como señalamos ya, 14.000 usuarios el año pasado han sido capacitados para el manejo de una tarjeta de crédito. Aunque tenemos una mayor cantidad de usuarios que ya saben utilizar y tienen tarjetas, y de hecho es, digamos, el mecanismo mediante el cual cobran las subvenciones económicas, que son alrededor ya de casi 30.000 usuarios. Quisiera comentar también que dentro de estas intervenciones y esta experiencia acumulada en estos 10 años, el programa con mucha satisfacción ha experimentado algunas iniciativas que son algunas propias de nuestro personal, pero otras son complementadas con otras instituciones. Y algunas de las últimas podemos señalar, por ejemplo, Taita Negocios, que es una plataforma virtual en el que ustedes, porque les dejo allí el enlace, pueden ingresar y allí pueden encontrar la exposición virtual de muchos productos para que puedan no solo conocerlas, sino también puedan hacer operaciones de compra y de esta manera contribuir al desarrollo de distintas iniciativas de negocios ancestrales. Y esto lo tenemos pues gestionado por nuestro equipo maravilloso de Pasco. Por otro lado, el año pasado, dentro de las buenas prácticas, junto con Taita Negocios, también, y ha continuado este año, la premiación y el reconocimiento de algunos emprendimientos que son considerados estrellas o emblemáticos en el Perú. Por ejemplo, allí tenemos a una usuaria, la guardiana de la papa nativa, que es en la región de Pasco también, presidentemente. Pues nuestros usuarios, a través de sus conocimientos ancestrales, han sembrado y cultivan la papa nativa y sus variedades, que forman parte de la canasta de alimentos de los peruanos. Y aquí tenemos algunas de nuestros usuarias que han conservado las técnicas ancestrales para mantener la calidad de estos productos que naturalmente se expenden ahora en muchos hogares peruanos. También el programa
Julio, I just want to keep track of some time, so maybe you just have 2 or 3 minutes, just so we can move forward. There's lots of questions coming for you in the chat box as well.
Perfecto. En esta recta final quería señalar que el programa estimula la capacidad productiva diversificada del programa y de esta intervención a través de los concursos de productos ancestrales. Y lo más importante que creo que me gustaría que ustedes queden con estas cifras. Todos los estudios hechos, tanto con metodología cuantitativa como la metodología cualitativa, han llegado a firme conclusión de que saberes productivos es una intervención que permite mejorar la salud emocional de los adultos mayores y reduce la depresión e incrementa la percepción de felicidad. Y naturalmente, como resultado de estas evidencias, forman parte hasta de 4 políticas sectoriales del gobierno, con lo cual esta intervención de saberes productivos se convierte en una intervención necesaria para los adultos mayores en el Perú y que muy bien podría ser escalables en otros países donde tenemos adultos mayores que están en situación de vulnerabilidad y de desprotección por parte del Estado. Muchas gracias en nombre de estos usuarios nuestros. El usuario que está al centro es el peruano más longevo del Perú. Tiene 124 años Y en honor a estos adultos mayores, desde el Perú y desde el programa Pensión 65, renovamos nuestro compromiso de su participación y su involucramiento como activos de la comunidad y del país. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. We did not see the picture of the oldest person in Peru, and maybe some people in the chat box might like to guess how old the oldest person in the Peru is. Maybe there will be a nice prize that we can organize. So suggestions in the chat box. I'm going to go for 113, but maybe Julio will let us know the exact age. Mabel says 98, so I think, Mabel, you might be shooting a little bit low, but I'm not so sure who else has some suggestions, so please keep those suggestions coming in. Julio, your presentation is fascinating because it's a question of government taking these programs to scale and trying to understand it. So I have a question for you on the institutionalization aspect. How did you work with other ministries to get support for your program? Maybe especially when people are thinking, well, these people are old, so maybe we can care for them just in the family or maybe through a formal system. How did you work to get that buy-in? And please tell us the age of the oldest person in Peru. Thank you.
El adulto mayor con mayor edad, que es don Marcelino, que aparece en la imagen al centro, este año va a cumplir 124 años. Es el peruano con mayor edad en el Perú. Nosotros lo cuidamos, lo conservamos con una serie de intervenciones, desde permitirle el acceso a la vacunación, las visitas domiciliarias y la entrega de la subvención económica, y lo hacemos naturalmente en colaboración con otras instituciones. Respecto a la pregunta de la institucionalización, el programa Pensión 65 pone a disposición de los gobiernos locales un asistente de saberes productivos que es un especialista del programa, capacitado, preparado para los fines de saberes productivos. La municipalidad toma la decisión de promover saberes productivos mediante un acuerdo de consejo municipal donde están los regidores y todas las autoridades, y le asignan un presupuesto, dinero. Esta alianza entre el gobierno local y el gobierno nacional a través de Pensión 65 es lo que impulsa la implementación de los saberes productivos. Y a partir de esa alianza entre esas dos instituciones del sector público, se suman otros aliados, que pueden ser otros ministerios, otros programas, la cooperación internacional e incluso el sector privado. Pero los que dinamizan, los que lideran la articulación en el territorio es el programa Pensión 65, que es la que lleva el liderazgo, y la municipalidad que se apropia de esta intervención al reconocer que contribuye al estado emocional de los adultos mayores, porque ellos se sienten solos, se sienten abandonados. Entonces ese estado de ánimo de tristeza, de congoja, se revierte al ser partícipes de saberes productivos, que son naturalmente sesiones, encuentros una vez a la semana, 2 veces al mes, con el acompañamiento de algún especialista o de algún técnico, pero luego se consagra con encuentros que son en días festivos y donde ellos hacen la exhibición de estos saberes, de sus productos, donde además pueden expender, pero también la población puede apreciar esa capacidad productiva que tienen nuestros adultos mayores.
Thank you. Thank you, Julio. Let's move on. And after this presentation, I will try to summarize some of the questions coming into the chat box. But we are going to switch gear a little bit. So we're moving from 2 rather advanced examples on the aging agenda, both with Help Age as well as the government of Peru. To hear from Jasmine Rajvandari, on experiences that are more at a nascent stage in Bangladesh. So we're going to learn a little bit more on some emerging work, some early considerations in program design, and how an operational team within the World Bank is working to support the government of Bangladesh on some of these early stage considerations, and how these interventions might interact with more formal or informal arrangements across the board. So Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Colin, and team, for inviting me. As I was listening, I must say it was both exciting, motivating, and a bit intimidating given the stage that we are in Bangladesh. And Quinn, as you know, quite well, Quinn has been involved in supporting in some of the design work. So I'm really glad he's here as well. So let me start. So what I'll be talking about today is a subcomponent of a project that is ongoing in Bangladesh, focused on cash transfer modernization, where we're trying to support the government to develop older people's clubs. Next slide, please. So just 2 seconds on the project itself that exists. It's a cash transfer modernization project, quite a large project in terms of its size, and has about 1.5 years or 2 to go right now. The implementation is done by the Department of Social Services from the Ministry of Social Welfare in Bangladesh. And the focus is very much on modernizing the service delivery of the cash transfer programs, particularly for the vulnerable groups. The government program, as you can see, is quite a large program of cash transfers to a variety of group of people. And the project has several components. What I'll be focusing on today is the cash and innovation component. And even within that, one part, given that this particular session here is really about looking at economic inclusion in an aging world. So just for those of you who may not know, Bangladesh is in South Asia. It is actually quite a large country, which you can't tell by looking on the map. There's close to over 150 million people, and it is one of the fastest aging countries in South Asia. The over 60 population is close to 13 million or so. And this cash transfer program on the old age allowance, as it says here, is almost 5 million people. So quite a large group of people who are receiving, but as was noted by one of our chat colleagues earlier, it still does not mean that coverage is 100% at all. Next slide, please. So we started thinking about, we've got these cash transfers going. They seem to be doing pretty well in terms of the modernization, which was the focus of the original project. But we also realized that that wasn't enough, that cash alone was not making a difference when it came to just giving a cash transfer. And so, in fact, it was HelpAge that helped us look through what could be done in addition. So the HelpAge study really found that it's not just financial, and there really is need for further support than just cash transfers, particularly because there's a need to have improvement in your access to services and care, looking at overall well-being, but also that the poor, particularly the elderly poor, need opportunities to be more economically productive. And we know, and as Quinn has presented very well, that older people's associations have existed now in many countries, particularly in East Asia, and there are fantastic good practices that could be quote unquote scaled up or copied. Even in Bangladesh, there are already over 150 OPAs. I'm not going to go into what is an OPA because clearly Quinn has done a fantastic job of that. But what we recognized is that in Bangladesh, they're not implemented by the government, number one. The Bangladesh government does not have any policy or manual about these older people's association, and it's not to scale yet. Next slide, please. So what we'll be doing is trying to help the government think through if they can do a little bit more, a little bit tweak, if you will, to the program. Of this huge program, this part of the pilot is only $3.5 million. So compared to the rest of the program, quite small. But in terms of bringing a change to the way government is implementing programs for the elderly, a very big shift, we think. So the idea here is to take the old age allowance beneficiaries and other elderly of Bangladesh and try and provide them additional opportunities. We will be doing a first phase or pilot rollout in 6 districts of Bangladesh. We have a little bit under 2 years, and we're really just focusing on can they be established. And there's obviously a definition of what is established, and Quinn referred to what would be sort of successful establishment. Next, please. So when we look at what activities are really linked to the focus of today, and I must say my one visit to a HelpAge supported Older People's Association in Bangladesh was fantastic. I walked into the room and, as you see in the pictures, men, women, different communities, different religions, different age groups were celebrating together in this fantastic way. And to see that happiness itself, to me, individually itself is, worth the investment. But I think we have to think bigger. And so here, when we looked at, all of the different activities, and as Quinn said, we are also looking at the holistic approach. But one of the parts we're very excited about, which we think is probably the bigger of the challenges, is the economic inclusion activities. So as Quinn was saying, probably we're following almost the same thing. We are doing some contextualization, which is why we're in design. But the key activities would really be around training to ensure that the capacity is there amongst the members of, here I'm using the word old people's clubs, and I will come to that in a bit, to manage a revolving fund, to really collect and use membership fees, to do fundraising of their own. And these clubs will have quite a large sum of money, I would say. $5,000 will be provided as seed money for the revolving fund. But also we're really interested to ensure that they're able to make productive use of those funds, whether it be livelihood support for other, investments in their community, etc. Next, please. So now I come to where we're at. So we have not started implementation. We are still in the design phase, and we already are facing many challenges. And one of the reasons I think I'm here is because we're really openly speaking about our challenges even at this early stage. So while we have seen a fantastic, almost wonderful opportunities that HelpAge has shared with us in terms of processes, examples, good practices, we still need to figure out how to do it in the context where it's the World Bank investing and the government implementing. So for us, a broader level in terms of policy challenges, one that we faced was how do we convince the government, this is the Department of Social Services, to partner with an NGO for implementation. And here for us, one of the things we're really concerned about is in a country like Bangladesh, where NGOs are so strong and are so close to communities, how do we ensure that we find that quality support that the OPAs need, especially in the early years, to really be these fantastic sustainable organizations? And how do we find the right NGO? It took a while, but the government has now agreed that there will be partnership with NGOs for the implementation. Obviously, what is in the terms of reference is going to make a big difference. Whether there are NGOs who know both the economic side, the community side, working with the elderly side in Bangladesh, enough to do this in the scale we want to, is a question. Second, even though the NGO that is hired will be directly responsible for everyday support to the OPAs, we have to recognize there has to be a strong role for the government as well. The Department of Social Services needs to have a role and be engaged at all levels of government. And particularly the Department of Social Services is not just an entity that is only at the central or more federal level, but also at all the levels of government. So how do we ensure that they have a role, both because it's important for them to be involved, but also to learn, and also if in fact they're going to be scaling up, they need to understand this. And that is part of the capacity building as well. But it's very important. We've gotten questions about, well, what will our role be as DSS if we have this huge contract for the NGO? Our third big sort of broad level challenge is really around the fund management and the flow. As those of you who are from the bank or have worked with the bank know, the bank has some quite tight procedures when it comes to financial management. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is that given that, as I mentioned before, this is a modernization project, we have now in Bangladesh all the beneficiaries receiving their cash transfers through bank accounts. My understanding from HelpAge is in most countries so far, and it's likely because of the country context as well, that the funds are actually not managed through banks, they are actually cash. So how do we look at a digitization of payments and continue the idea of modernization? How do we ensure that banks actually will be okay with the transfer of funds when an OPC, Older Persons Club, is not a recognized entity? How do we ensure that the revolving fund, which is quite a large investment, is sustainable and is not seen as too high of a risk? Next, please. And linked to that are operational questions. Some of this I was thinking when Himanshi introduced all of us, was she has exactly spoken what is in my mind. A lot of the things we are thinking about operationally as well, despite having the good practices from Quinn and HelpAge, are in the context of Bangladesh. What would be the eligible age for these members? So for example, for the old age allowance beneficiaries in Bangladesh, for women, the eligible age is 62. For men, it's 64. Do we want to continue that? Do we want to put a flat age? And this is about, just those who are older in terms of eligibility for membership. We want to look at the numbers. We have examples that HelpAge has shared with us, but we also have a shorter time frame in Bangladesh to do this work. Do we need to think about how we can ensure that there is enough quality support, and maybe the number of people in OPC needs to be smaller? We're also looking at how we need to balance the prioritization. Because the focus of DSS is very much those who are already recipients, we want to ensure that they are involved. But as we know, because that does not cover all of the elderly in Bangladesh, we also need to make sure there's opportunities for others. We're very interested to ensure that gender is seen as a priority, particularly in terms of having more women involved. Looking at which age groups we're looking at. So even if we're to go, to say 62, in terms of life expectancy, how do we manage the different age groups? We don't want, for example, everybody to be the active 60s group, right? Especially if there are others. And similarly, when it comes to the revolving fund, how do we look at who gets that, particularly because we have such a short time frame for our pilot? For those of you who know Bangladesh as well, there are many, many good practices in Bangladesh around financial inclusion of the poor. I mean, obviously institutions like BRAC are well known, but BRAC actually doesn't have much for those who are over 62. But yet there are things like loan conditions, for example, interest rates, that we may need to learn from the other Bangladesh examples, so that we make something that is really useful in the context of Bangladesh. Please excuse if any of you hear there's dogs barking in the street, so apologies. And then finally, the idea of the modernization. We do not want the modernization to be a reason for exclusion of any of the beneficiaries. And we would see that, in fact, the capacity building I talked about earlier would actually be linked to getting them bank accounts if they don't have, helping in terms of digital literacy, looking at how they also can better manage their funds, etc. Next, please. So for us, in terms of next steps, we have a draft terms of reference with the government for a service provider. They're going to need to process that and contract the service provider. With all the luck, we will get somebody that really works closely and well with the government and is able to provide the quality support. Second, there'll be a development and operations manual for these OPCs. With all of that being done, we really cannot expect to start before January of next year. Next, please. And finally, we're thinking about post the pilot, even though we're in early design stages, because we are very worried. As a pilot with government, with an entity that is responsible for a holistic development, which includes economic development of the elderly, if this pilot doesn't go well, it would likely mean that the DSS doesn't support OPCs. So we are very concerned to try and make sure we're able to do quality work. We want to ensure that these OPCs are sustainable. As Quinn has said, it takes 2 years, and from what we've seen, quite intensive support to them. Are we going to be able to do that in the limited time that we have? Are we able to provide quality support? Do we want to look at an impact evaluation? How do we document the processes and the lessons learned? How do we continue to engage the government? And how do we ensure that in parallel, we do the homework so that there are some policies or registration or guidelines developed for OPCs? And for us, this is one of the crucial things because as you've seen, Quinn referred to OPAs, I referred to OPCs. The government did not want to use the terminology OPA. And for me, that's unfortunate in that I think, to me, a club and an association are quite different in terms of the level of empowerment one would expect. And we really think that, the empowerment of the elderly is a big part of what OPAs or OPCs can provide. So for us, there's a lot of conversations that we're going to have with the government throughout the pilot, and this continuous engagement of the government, not just saying, this is what the pilot is and look at what success the pilot has, but also in thinking through the role of the elderly in a society like Bangladesh. So for us, as I said, we have a lot of questions. We've been getting a lot of help already from HelpAge, but I think the Peru examples and others that I've heard about and continue to learn from are really useful for us. And I'm extremely pleased to be here, less because I'm sharing, but more because I'm learning. Thank you.
Jasmine, thanks so much. A very interesting presentation, and a very candid presentation, and a very real-time look at some of the challenges that you are facing. We are running quite short on time, so what I would like to do is maybe to bring all of our presenters back to the same screen, Julio and Quinn and Himanshi also. I'm going to run through a few questions, so I would ask you to be quite brief because what I want to do is to try and summarize some of the questions that are coming into the chat box. And my first question is going to be, I'll start off with you, Jasmine, and also Julio and Quinn. One of the big themes that came through all of your presentations was this issue of a holistic approach. So the idea that these OPAs or OPCs were not simply just for old age population groups, but there was some community link. And then in particular, there was an intergenerational link also with youth. So I just want to invite you all to talk briefly about what this holistic approach truly means and maybe why it was important as part of your policy dialogue. So I will start off over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Colin. And thank you for letting me go first, because I think Quinn probably has the perfect answers. But in terms of our, our conversations with the government particularly, I think two things. One is that for many people, when they think about elderly, they think health. And so for us, it was an opportunity to really expand and add in these other parts that they don't normally think about. So I think this idea of holistic is really a useful one in terms of looking at holistic development, right? I mean, I think all of us would agree when we're doing sectoral work, it's not as effective as when we're doing work that is joined up. And I think it's a similar idea. And I think the linkages that are there in daily life is very much reflected when we can talk about the linkage between health, between education, livelihoods, income generation, how you, work with others. So that's one aspect. On the age holistic, I must say that I'm still struggling with this. Having come from a background of working with children's clubs and women's clubs, I've seen where a group of peers allows them to be more open and empowered and powerful. But yet I understand from HelpAge and the many examples that because there are both younger and older people in these groups, that has actually worked extremely well as well because they support each other. So for me, it's a bit of a learning, and I'm very interested to see in Bangladesh what comes out of it in terms of particularly the sustainabilities of these OPCs. Because I think in the long run, if an entity like an OPC or OPA exists, what they want to do then becomes up to them. And I think that's why we need to just get them started. So happy to try and see what can be successful when it comes to looking at the holistic approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Jasmine. And I think you're also addressing some questions from Rupon from the chat box in terms of this issue of sustainability. There's more in the chat box perhaps for you. Quinn, over to you. And you're on mute.
Yes, HelpAge has been working with OPAs for the last 35 years in most countries in Asia and also around the world. And there was a lot of learning. And why we shift from project OPAs to the more holistic, more multifunctional OPAs is because that older people have many issues and many wish and have many wants. And so by just focusing on Project OPA, only 1 or 2 themes, that was not attractive to older people. It did not really meet the need of older people. So therefore it was not very sustainable. It was not very scalable. So once we shift, once we listen to older people and meet their needs and what they want, and enable them to design the OPA themselves, they added more and more component. And that's why we have 8 to 12 component now. And that was not because of health aid, because of older people saying we want more component because that is what we need. And because of that, it became more sustainable. It became more attractive, and we were able to sell it to the government. And that is why in many countries now, there's about 10 countries now in Asia where it has become a national government model where funding are from the government. And so hopefully in Bangladesh soon in the future, that the government will take this model and will then fund it and will help to scale up throughout the country, because only the government has the capacity to scale it nationally, not the donors. Okay.
Thanks. Well, let me move over to Himanshi and Julio exactly on this point, Quinn, around the capacity to scale. But part of the question of the capacity to scale, again, comes back to the institutionalization question. So how do we make the case effectively for this when we're designing programs, but also during implementation? In the chat box, Fiona asked a question at the beginning of the session, which was hinting at the idea that we need to think holistically. We need to think about the connection of the elderly groups and of the young population. So potentially some of these programs, as a government official, you may think that it's difficult to make a justification for these programs when a government faces many other choices and things to support. So Himanshi and Julio, I would be interested in your experiences on how you make the case for these investments and how you sustain support for these investments. And I noted in Peru, evaluation seems to be very important. So if we can hear anything about the role of evaluation, that would be great. Over to you, Himanshi.
Thanks, Colin. I lost you there for a second, but I think I caught the last part on how to make these, make the case to governments and how to make them sustainable. So one of the things that we have, we've sort of tried to, the point that we've tried to make in the overall aging and longevity agenda is the need to sort of have a life cycle approach. And I saw Fiona ask that question, how can you do that? Let me give some concrete examples. So say, adult learning systems that we talk about, we are starting to talk about them in the context of lifelong learning. So when we focus on our education systems, it is not necessarily continue the focus on the children and youth, but by having these lifelong learning systems, you can essentially come in at different stages in one's life. So the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, you can both evaluate the needs at different stages and you can create more flexible systems. So that is a very, it requires in some ways a rethinking at the policy level, but once you're on board, essentially what you're doing is you're making systems that are adaptable not only to age groups, but then also to shocks. And it allows you to be very nimble. Not just in education, that was one example, but even in sort of financial protection, we're seeing an increase in focus on covering the informal. Hello, I think I lost you there. But I see we see an increase in the focus on covering the informal sector and sort of doing nudges at a young level, making the schemes attractive so they start saving early. So having this longer life cycle approach to approaching the aging agenda becomes extremely important. And in some ways, blurring the lines, old is not necessarily one bucket group that you need to think about when they reach that age. You need to start early. And, I really picked on a message in the chat box. You actually grow old from the day you're born. On the very next day, you are older by a day. And that's essentially also the spirit with which we need to approach both thinking the policies and the dialogue. And I'll stop there.
Julio, over to you. Thank you.
Bien. Quisiera partir comentando sobre la primera cuestión que se está discutiendo sobre la mirada holística al adulto mayor. Debemos partir señalando que todas las personas adultas mayores necesitan vivir una vida plena, independiente, donde ellos se sientan en autonomía. Y eso pasa por identificar varias de sus necesidades y en todas sus dimensiones. Los adultos mayores, por lo general, por la avanzada edad, pierden su capacidad visual, se deterioran el funcionamiento orgánico y es por esta razón de que se necesita que ellos accedan a servicios de salud. Por ejemplo, durante la pandemia, 7 de cada 10 adultos, de los que han fallecido por COVID han sido adultos mayores. Por eso nosotros promovemos acceso a la vacunación contra COVID y tenemos cuidados y protegidos al 94% de nuestros usuarios. Pero también la otra necesidad es que por lo general están solos, sus hijos ya salieron de sus casas, están en las grandes ciudades y ellos se quedaron solos en sus casas cuidando su comunidad, cuidando su distrito y su caserío. Entonces, esa soledad los lleva a la depresión y es por esta razón que ellos necesitan reencontrarse, estar en interacción con otros adultos mayores, necesitan participar en actividades de la comunidad, necesitan ser incluidos en la actividad de producción de la propia comunidad. Y es por esta razón donde nosotros recuperamos los saberes, fomentamos la participación de ellos. Y claro, por supuesto, en la capacidad productiva, pues es donde desarrollamos estas iniciativas de emprendimiento que, como hemos señalado, ya son alrededor de 14,000 y que ha modificado, ha transformado sus vidas y muchos de ellos ya salieron de la situación de pobreza extrema a pobreza. Entonces, la mirada es en todas sus dimensiones y me parece que toda política pública dirigida a los adultos mayores no debe ver únicamente la carencia económica. Eso es importante, sin duda, para que pueda garantizarse su subsistencia a través de asegurar la alimentación, el gasto en abrigo, en transporte, etc. Pero no es menor las otras necesidades. Respecto al segundo tema en cuestión, ¿cómo consolidamos, cómo hacemos que estas iniciativas sean sostenibles? En principio, la evidencia científica lo señala de que estas intervenciones que hemos comentado como saberes productivos no solamente genera un impacto en la vida de los adultos mayores, sino que además lo que hace es que otras instituciones colaboren, participen de manera sinérgica entre las propias instituciones del sector público, pero también con los del sector privado. En este momento, Saberes Productivos es una intervención que en el programa Pensión 65 no tiene un presupuesto, pero estamos trabajando una iniciativa en nuestro modelo operacional que nos permita darle sostenibilidad en el tiempo para que esta intervención de Saberes Productivos escale, crezca, y no solo se limite a los adultos mayores de pensión 65, sino que sea un impacto para todos los adultos mayores del Perú. Y es por esta razón que ya está incluido en todas las políticas sectoriales.
Thank you, Julio. We are reaching the end of our open house. But before we end, I want to ask my favorite question for every seminar that I do. So I will be asking our presenters only. So Quinn, Jasmine, and Julio in this order. Looking back on the work you've done for the last year or for the last 10 years, if you could do one single thing differently, what would you have done? So if you look back, if there's one thing that you would have to do differently, what would that one thing be? and you have 30 seconds each. So just tell us the one thing that would be difficult so we can end promptly on time. That's a very nasty question to ask you, but while you think of your answer, Claudia, we may just put up the evaluation slide for this event. We do like to make sure that these events are useful. So we do have a poll, and we would like to ask you if the ideas and the materials from this session, would you use the ideas and materials for this session for your future work in this area? Strongly agree, agree, not agree, or disagree, disagree, or strongly agree. And then you scroll down, and there is one more question. Would you recommend this series of webinars to your colleagues? Strongly agree, agree, not agree, or disagree, disagree, or strongly agree. I do need to read those out for our translators. So let me thank our translators for always making these events a success. And let me thank our extensive backroom team also for bringing this event to you today. But a huge thanks to our participants and our panelists for sharing information so candidly. With that, I will go back to Quinn, Jasmine, and Julio. Julio, for last words, if you could do one thing again, what would it be?
So for me, 40 years ago, I studied civil engineer, and I was an engineer for 10 years with a construction company. And by accident, I moved to aging and worked with HealthAid for the last 20 years. And I felt that, oh, if I would, back 40 years ago, I would have gone and studied not engineering, but maybe working with older people, geriatric care or development instead.
Perfect. I'm glad you didn't say you were regretting working for HealthAid. So that's a good good contribution. Jasmine, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just looking back about a year or so. And I think for those in the bank, this would be quite contrary to what we should say. But given that there is a time limit on this project, I would say we should have accelerated our preparation so we have enough time to implement.
Thank you, Jasmine. And Julio, over to you.
Me hubiera gustado que la cultura de respeto, de valoración a los adultos mayores hubiera comenzado mucho antes, porque quizás no hubiéramos sufrido los impactos durante la pandemia como hemos observado, no solo en el Perú, sino en el mundo entero. Una cultura de cuidado y de respeto a nuestros adultos mayores. Y quiero terminar agradeciendo a nuestro equipo, particularmente a nuestros técnicos de saberes productivos del programa Pensión 65, que son nuestros baluartes en el territorio que en nombre del Estado recorren todas las municipalidades del país, alentando la implementación de esta experiencia que les hemos compartido esta mañana. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, everybody. We're just at the top of the hour. It is a wrap. The presentations will be circulated to you, all contact details of participants. So if you have any follow-up, please feel free to follow up on all of those things with us. And a warm thanks also to our partners in crime for this session on the longevity series within the World Bank. We'd be very glad to hear and to learn from you all today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.